做一天了，一个活儿没有啊。
I sat all day and didn't do a thing.
On May 10th, in a foreign trade factory workshop in China, a worker was seen dozing off, saying he had spent the entire day sitting around without any work to do. If this situation continues, he fears he'll have to go home early for the new year. A blogger shared a video stating that foreign trade manufacturers are struggling due to the US-China tariff conflict. The once bustling and noisy workshop scene is now gone. Foreign trade vlogger Mr. Tan shared on a video program on May 9th that the situation for Chinese foreign traders has been challenging.
那现在我们这些外贸人怎么样呢？
Currently, if you search for foreign trade orders on China's Douyin platform, you'll see a flood of posts from foreign trade beauties and handsome men from the Middle East, Russia, and Africa.
To compensate for the loss of the U.S. market, the Chinese government is encouraging exporters to turn to Europe, as well as Belt and Road countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. On May 9th, the Chinese State Administration of Foreign Exchange revealed that China's overseas assets increased by about $48 billion in the first quarter, an increase of 28% compared to last year. This shows that under the pressure of the trade war, Chinese companies are accelerating their overseas expansion, attempting to alleviate external tensions by creating jobs and economic growth abroad. In recent years, Chinese companies have been turning to Southeast Asia, but these developing countries cannot afford to buy that many goods. The local markets are fragmented, with somewhat inadequate commercial infrastructure. A recent report from the Chinese media outlet Titan Media mentioned that Europe has a mature consumer market, logistics, and supporting payment systems, but the market is still fragmented due to the large number of countries with distinct national characteristics. In contrast, North America, with its single-country market, is the most mature and unified, with high consumer spending and a vibrant business environment. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent recently told media personality Tucker Carlson that without the U.S. market, China cannot survive. There's no other country or group of countries that can absorb China's exports to the U.S., and no government would risk its domestic industries and employment just to take in China's cheap goods. It's important to point out that the U.S. has been closely monitoring and blocking Chinese companies using Southeast Asia for re-export trade. On the other hand, some Chinese exporting companies are now looking to set up factories in the U.S. to avoid high tariffs. According to the South China Morning Post, in recent weeks, Chinese manufacturers from various industries have been quietly but rapidly setting up new factories in the U.S. Industry insiders say this highlights the effectiveness of President Trump's Bring Manufacturing Back to America policy. On April 11th, the Chinese Communist Party announced that it would raise tariffs on U.S. goods to 125%. In response, President Trump eventually raised tariffs on Chinese goods to 145%. This trade war has indeed posed a serious threat to China, as Trump's high tariffs has blocked Chinese manufacturers from accessing the world's largest market. The escalating tariff war has caused significant disruptions to China's export chain. Export factories in Zhejiang and Guangdong, two major foreign trade provinces, are facing production stoppages, with warehouses piled high with goods originally planned for export. Negative sentiment is widespread among the Chinese public. According to reports from Caixin and other media outlets, since the implementation of the reciprocal tariff policy, many cargo ships and freight flights between China and the U.S. have been cancelled. Exporters have suspended shipments, and the busy export scenes at Shanghai port came to an abrupt halt in just a few days. The air freight market has also been severely impacted. Due to the sudden high tariffs, exporters and customers have had to renegotiate the sharing of costs, leading to the suspension of many shipments. In response to the tariffs, some Chinese companies are adjusting their supply chains and moving parts of their production processes to other countries or regions, but this increases production and logistics costs. As early as President Trump's first term, to avoid tariffs imposed after 2018, Chinese manufacturers set up factories in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Mexico, using these markets to bypass U.S. restrictions. This is known as place of origin washing, where goods are processed minimally in a third country, relabeled, and then exported to the target country. However, this time, Trump has imposed tariffs on almost all countries and is cracking down on the relabeling practice. Advertisements offering third-country transshipment services have spread widely since April. Some neighboring countries have noticed an abnormal surge in Chinese goods. Fearing they might become transshipment hubs for Chinese products, these countries are tightening policies to prevent trade fraud. U.S. economist Davy J. Wong stated that under high U.S. tariffs, many Chinese companies have been forced to resort to place of origin washing. This reflects the struggle of Chinese companies trying to survive after losing global trust. Mexico and several Southeast Asian countries are negotiating with the U.S. to align their tariffs with U.S. measures, despite China's warnings. These warnings are losing influence response as countries prioritize their own economic interests. The U.S. is also implementing a maritime blockade, planning to impose fees of millions of dollars on large Chinese ships docking at its ports. This has intensified the trade war. China's manufacturing sector was once a global giant, with the country boasting the title of the world's factory. However, as nations close their doors to Chinese exports, China now faces an economic crisis, and the world's factory is slowly shutting down. In the wave of globalization, China has become a manufacturing superpower over the past few decades. In 2023, China accounted for 35% of global GDP, nearly 3 times that of the United States at 12%. This growth was driven by factors such as a lack of labor protection, minimal quality control, and massive government subsidies. China's export-driven growth model became the backbone of its economy, bringing nearly $1 trillion in trade surpluses last year. After Donald Trump was re-elected as President of the United States, he sought to reverse the economic model that he believed harmed U.S. interests, while providing a lifeline to the Chinese Communist Party. On April 2nd, Trump announced global tariffs, and leaders from various countries reached out to him to seek trade negotiations, everyone except Beijing. Analysts soon realized that the CCP was Trump's main target. The CCP chose to resist, vowing not to back down and urging other nations to join in their opposition. On April 9th, Trump announced a 90-day suspension of reciprocal tariffs on countries other than China, giving these countries time to reach trade agreements with the U.S. The U.S. absorbs $400 billion of Chinese goods every year, accounting for over 14% of Chinese exports. The current U.S. tariff of up to 145% has essentially shut China out of the American market. In April, the Chinese government proposed that local governments provide loans to maintain factory operations, with tech giants helping exporters pivot to domestic sales. Experts warn that this move will further intensify deflationary pressures, triggering fierce price wars between businesses, which will squeeze profit margins and lead to higher unemployment in China. As a result, some Chinese companies are surviving on subsidies, becoming zombie companies that can only pay off their debts, while small and medium-sized manufacturers face bankruptcy. Shifting exports to the domestic market requires consumer spending power, but Chinese household consumption is 20% lower than the global average. In recent years, Chinese consumers have been steadily downgrading their consumption. During the recent May Day holiday, many people opted to camp instead of staying in hotels, and some young people traveling to Hong Kong preferred to sleep in McDonald's and KFCs. For decades, the CCP has supported inefficient and wasteful state-owned enterprises, while suppressing private companies and relying on foreign consumers, weakening the domestic market. Reforming Social Security, pensions, and the financial system could narrow the gap, but it would take years or even decades to fully restructure the economic model. This long-term solution cannot immediately address the pressing issues faced by small and medium-sized manufacturers. Recent official data shows that in April, China's Producer Price Index, PPI, decreased by 2.7% year-on-year, marking the largest drop in 6 months. The Consumer Price Index, CPI, also saw a year-on-year decline for the 3rd consecutive month, worsening deflation. This highlights the impact of the U.S.-China trade war on China's economy. Domestic competition in China has already squeezed profit margins, and the shrinking overseas market is making things worse. A manufacturer producing mosquito repellent products for Walmart has had its goods stuck in warehouses. An outdoor furniture manufacturer set up a factory in Vietnam to avoid tariffs, saying their efforts were in vain. A manufacturer producing Christmas decorations for Walmart and Costco has seen its orders evaporate and is now in survival mode. With the real estate market collapsing, the Chinese government has increasingly focused on the manufacturing sector, particularly on what it calls new productive forces like electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and solar panels. This strategy carries risks, as overcapacity is causing other countries to push back against Chinese goods. Apart from the U.S., India has imposed anti-dumping duties on Chinese products, Brazil has raised tariffs, and the European Union has launched investigations into China's subsidies and imports. The Biden administration has already imposed tariffs of 25% on electric vehicle batteries, 50% on solar panels, and 100% on electric vehicles. The EU and Turkey have also set tariffs of up to 45% and 40% respectively on Chinese vehicles. Brazil is gradually increasing tariffs on electric vehicles as well, wary of becoming a dumping ground for cheap Chinese cars. These global measures reflect concerns about the threat cheap Chinese goods to local manufacturing industries. Nomura Holdings analyst believes that under the tariff war, the massive influx of cheap Chinese goods could severely disrupt emerging economies, especially in Asia. This could lead to more serious trade imbalances, stronger deflationary pressures, and greater fiscal expenditures. After 3 years of the pandemic and the lifting of strict lockdowns, China's economy has not recovered as expected. During the 2008 financial crisis, China used $600 billion stimulus plan, about 12% of its GDP at the time, to revive the economy. The stimulus drove real estate infrastructure growth. However, now the real estate sector is in long-term crisis, local government debt is soaring, and large-scale loan-driven stimulus has done more harm than good. In the CCP's pursuit of GDP growth, local governments have played a key role. Over the years, local governments have accumulated massive debts, with the total amount possibly exceeding 100 trillion yuan. Without China, the U.S. has many alternatives. Qiu Ta-sheng, executive director of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and adjunct professor at the Department of Economics at Tonghai University, stated that the U.S. is building new supply chains. If the U.S.-India tariff negotiations make progress, it would mean that the new supply chains are forming more quickly. Qiu added that many countries at China's level, such as India, Vietnam, and Mexico, have had the chance to compete for the role of the world's future factory. The production model of the world's future factory may change, potentially not relying on one country, but instead consisting of multiple emerging markets. Tariffs have shaken China's industrial heartland, and this will directly impact China's economic growth. In January of this year, the CCP announced a GDP growth target of 5% for 2024, but some economists have dismissed it as fabricated. For 2025, the CCP has set a growth target of around 5% once again. Professor Fan Jiazhong of the Department of Economics at National Taiwan University stated that no one can accurately say what China's actual economic growth rate is, not even the Chinese Communist Party itself. The data reported from different regions are all fabricated. Based on recent economic data, it appears that China's economy is worse than last year. Many analysts have downgraded their economic growth forecast for China in 2025. Goldman Sachs has lowered its estimate to 4%, while UBS forecasts just 3.4% growth this year, making it the most pessimistic prediction among major investment banks. The surge in unemployment is another danger. The investment bank Nomura warned that the trade war could cause China to lose as many as 16 million jobs. Goldman Sachs estimates that up to 20 million people could be affected by the disappearance of U.S. orders. U.S. economist David J. Wong stated that this could ultimately lead to 30 to 35 million people losing their jobs. Recently, many Chinese bloggers have posted videos about the growing number of street vendors classified by the government as part of the flexible employment category, with a noticeable trend of younger people joining this workforce. Veteran political and economic commentator Wu Jialong stated that China's economy is already in recession and could gradually descend into a situation similar to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Against this backdrop, senior economic and trade officials from China and the U.S. began 2 days of trade negotiations in Switzerland. Since the U.S.-China trade war broke out in early April, there has been nearly a month-long stalemate. China has maintained a firm stance, repeatedly refusing to negotiate under pressure. On the U.S. side, President Trump has stated multiple times that negotiations have begun, but China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Commerce have publicly denied this, even calling it fake news. Despite China's official statement claiming that the talks, Reuters cited sources revealing that after Trump announced tariffs on April 2nd, Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao quietly reached out to U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, but was rejected due to his insufficient rank. Reports indicate that while China has publicly responded firmly, Chinese officials are increasingly concerned about the economic impact of the tariffs. As China's trade partners began negotiating with the U.S., China feared being isolated. One of the main reasons China is willing to make concessions is that Chinese companies are struggling to avoid bankruptcy. On May 8th, the US and UK jointly announced a landmark bilateral trade agreement. Trump stated that regardless of whether a trade deal is reached with trade partners, the 10% baseline tariff will remain, although some countries may be granted exemptions if they offer significant trade concessions. As the tariff negotiations began in Geneva, China's top state-run media, People's Daily, published an article on May 10th, stating that expecting to solve the problem with just 1 or 2 rounds of negotiations is unrealistic, and that China has a clear understanding of the complexity of the talks. China expert Yue Shan commented that the U.S.-China trade war will indeed continue with talks and negotiations. However, by coming to the table now, regardless of China's public defense, it's essentially seeking peace. Now China is in a disadvantageous position. Trump is not in a hurry. After establishing a tariff alliance, China will face more difficulty. The U.S. will have more leverage, and the initiative is now in Trump's hands.